Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today I want to start talking to you about marine ecology. Marine ecology is in some ways a lot like land ecology or terrestrial ecology, but in some ways it's nothing like land ecology or terrestrial ecology, and that's going to be one of the things that I want to point out during this lesson. You may have taken an ecology class, and you may have even had an ecology segment in your biology class, but unfortunately you probably learned a lot about land ecology, and your teacher didn't talk very much about the other 66% of the world that's covered with water and what those ecosystems are like. And like I said, even though those ecosystems are similar in some ways, they're different in others. So that's one of the things I want to start tussing out. So how do I want to begin talking about it? I want to start talking about energy. How it flows through marine ecosystems, how it moves from the bottom to the very, very top predators in marine ecosystems, and what each level energy gets to is called, what the different parts of a marine ecosystems are named so we can identify them, and we can also start understanding how those different levels affect each other. What happens when organisms go up or down? What happens when organisms go extinct? Last, I want to actually physically start talking about the differences between land ecosystems and marine ecosystems. So let's start with how energy flows through a marine ecosystem. Energy flows through a marine ecosystem in one direction. That means that energy enters as light or, in some cases, chemicals, and it never becomes those light or chemicals again. That means that energy, if you're at the top of the ocean, shines on a piece of phytoplankton, and that phytoplankton converts that light energy to food energy, sugar. But that sugar never becomes light again. The energy contained in that sugar molecule never becomes sunlight. Same thing's true for the bottom of the ocean. There's no light, but there are chemicals being released by geothermal springs, underwater hot springs. And those chemicals, just like sugar, have energy. So there's bacteria down there that eat those chemicals, those geothermal chemicals, and they convert them to sugars. But again, those new sugars never get converted back to those geothermal chemicals. Because energy enters but never becomes those same things again that it entered as, light or chemicals, it's said to go in one direction in an ecosystem. It doesn't cycle. Every time energy moves up an organism in a food web, that's called a trophic level, or an eating level. Here we have three trophic levels: diatoms, krill, and whales. The diatoms are your first trophic level. They're the organisms that are converting, in this case, sunlight to sugar, which krills are eating, and then the whales are eating the krill. So 3 levels: diatoms, krill, and whales. Now, as those krill eat those diatoms, they're not getting all the energy that is contained inside those diatoms. They're losing some. They're losing some because they might not eat the diatoms, and they're losing some because because diatoms use some of that energy that they originally had to actually function and live. As a result, as you move up trophic level, your energy availability gets less and less. Counterintuitively, the very, very highest organisms on a food web are actually getting the least energetic food. If you think of a pound of grass and a pound of lion meat, the pound of grass has a lot more calories of energy in it than that pound of lion meat. If you think of a pound of phytoplankton and a pound of great white shark meat, same thing's true. The pound of phytoplankton has a lot more energy in it than the pound of great white shark meat. Now, even though energy availability is getting less and less as you go up a marine food web, your organism size is getting more and more. And that's what this is actually showing you. Diatoms are microscopic, and then there's krill, which you can see but barely, and then there's there's whales, which you can obviously see. They're the largest organisms ever to exist on Earth. Even though in this case, killer whales are eating krill and not getting as much energy as even the diatoms have, or really as the krill originally had, they're much, much larger. This is different than terrestrial ecosystems. If you look at a forest, most of the organisms there, most of the biomass that you see are primary producers. Most of them are plants. And then you have a smaller amount of organisms that's herbivores and a smaller amount of organisms still that's carnivores. In marine ecosystems, that's not true. It's reversed. Most of your biomass is actually at the top, whales and large sharks. And as you move down, your organisms are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Even though energy increases as you move up, even though energy decreases as you move up a marine food web, the organism size is going up and up and up. And the reason is mostly because the very, very largest organisms in the ecosystem, whales, are usually eating pretty low. They're usually eating either diatoms or krill, primary producers or first level consumers. Very rarely do you have whales at the top that eat meat. In fact, of the 10 great whales, the smallest one, which is the sperm whale, is actually the largest predator on Earth. Sperm whales represent the largest an organism can be conceivably through evolution while still eating meat, while still eating a relatively unenergetic food. So let's start talking about what the names of the different parts of the marine food web are. We're going to start with primary producers, or autotrophs. Primary producers, or autotrophs, are the things that bring energy into a food web. In this case, it's phytoplankton, but it could also be chemosynthetic bacteria on the bottom of the ocean. And then you have consumers, or heterotrophs. Those are organisms that eat, organisms that aren't primary producers. Anything in a food web that generally isn't on the very, very bottom is a consumer or a heterotroph. And next, you have apex predators. Apex predators are organisms that eat in a food web but are not themselves eaten. Organisms that are consumed but do not, in fact, organisms that consume but are not themselves consumed. Apex predators can be at the top, but they can also be relatively low in a food web. For instance, giant baleen whales would actually eat krill. So they're only third-level consumers, even though they're so large. And they aren't consumed by anything, so they would be considered an apex predator. It's important to understand that apex predators is a role in an ecosystem, not a level. You can be any level in an ecosystem and still be an apex predator. So let's go through this food web and let's start identifying different parts and different cause and effect relationships that you can see. The first, let's identify the primary producers. Primary producers here would be phytoplankton, the organisms at the very, very bottom of the food web. Anything that eats, but is anything that does not eat in a food web. So there you go, phytoplankton. It doesn't eat, it just converts light energy into food energy. The apex predators would be, like I said, adult herring. They're the only organisms here that are eating, but are not themselves eaten. What about your primary consumers, your first level consumers? Well, they would be the things that eat phytoplankton. In this case, larvaceans, krill, large and small herbaceous copepods, water fleas, barnacle larvae, mollusk larvae. All of these would be your primary consumers. All of these would be the things that are the first trophic level that actually eats in the food web. Second trophic level, because primary producers of phytoplankton is your first, but they're the first trophic level that actually eats. What are your secondary consumers? Well, they would be the things that eat the primary consumers. In this case, it's jellyfishes and comb jellies, hourworms, carnivorous copepods, and amphipods. Now let's talk about organisms' relationships. These arrows are actually indicating the flow of energy. Very, very simplistically, they just mean that the organism that's pointing to is eating the lower organism. But really what they're showing you is the flow of energy. It enters in phytoplankton and goes up to larvaceans and then up to adult herring. An arrow that leaps around would mean that arrowworms sometimes eat each other or consume each other, cannibalism. So let's test out some relationships. What would happen to krill if adult herring populations increase? What would happen to krill if adult herring populations increase? Well, if we look at this arrow means that adult herring is eating krill. So if adult herring goes up, that would mean more krill is being eaten, so they would go down. Adult herring would go up, but krill would go down. What would happen to comb jelly populations if barnacle larvae populations increase? So here's comb jellies, here's barnacle larvae. Now this is a little bit of a harder one to understand. Here's comb jellies, and they eat barnacle larvae, but why would an increase in barnacle larvae affect comb jellies? That would just mean that they'd have more food. It wouldn't necessarily mean that comb jellies are having more sex. That's true, but you have to think about it a different way. More food in a population means that that population is going to be healthier. It's going to start living longer. And a healthier, longer lived population is going to have more reproductive opportunities than a not so healthy, not so long lived populations. So even though it may not be immediate as adult herring going up and krill going down, more barnacle larvae would ultimately mean comb jelly populations would go up. What would happen to water flea populations if adult herring go down? What would happen to water flea populations if adult herring go down? Here's adult herring, here's water fleas. It's the opposite of our krill question, right? If adult herrings go down, water fleas would go up because there'd be less things eating water fleas. Last, I want to really suss out the main differences between land and water ecosystems, the main differences between terrestrial ecosystems and marine ecosystems. So, again, on land, really the only source of primary production is from the sun. However, in marine, there's two types of primary production. There's photosynthesis, which could be marine plants, it could be phytoplankton, it could be seaweed. But on the bottom of the ocean, there's also this thing called chemosynthesis. Bacteria at the bottom of the ocean can take chemicals released by underwater hot springs and geothermic energy and convert those chemicals into food, just like phytoplankton can convert sunlight energy into food. Second main difference is that on land, most of your primary production comes from plants. But actually in marine ecosystems, and for that matter in the entire Earth, most of your primary production comes from algae. Most of the oxygen you're breathing right now does not come from trees. Why? Because the majority of Earth is not covered with dirt. And if you think of the idea that the majority of Earth isn't covered with dirt, even though there's some Earth that's covered with dirt, there's also areas like deserts and the Arctic that has no primary production on it. And as a result, most of the Earth is not only covered with water, but in most of that water, there's algae, whether really, really small, phytoplankton, or larger algae like seaweed, and they are what's providing most of your oxygen, most of your primary production. So, to review, how does energy flow through a marine ecosystem? Again, it goes in one direction. It does not cycle. It enters either through chemicals or through light, and it never becomes those chemicals at the bottom of the ocean or light at the top of the ocean again. And as it moves up a marine ecosystem, every trophic level is removing some, so energy availability is getting less and less and less. Even though that's true, as you get higher on an ecosystem, even though organisms are eating less energetic food, generally speaking in a marine ecosystem, those organisms are getting larger. Your biomass is increasing, whereas your energy availability is decreasing as you move up trophic levels. Then we learned, okay, so if you have different trophic levels, how do they affect each other? We learned that as energy goes, as organisms in a trophic level increase, generally the organisms below them decrease. And vice versa, as organisms below them increase, that will also increase the organisms above them. Last but not least, we learned about the main differences between land ecosystems and marine ecosystems. Land ecosystems, you have most of your biomass at the bottom, and then it gets smaller as you go up. That's not true. Land ecosystems, you have only photosynthesis. That's not true in marine ecosystems either. And on land, your main primary producer is plants. Marine ecosystems, you have that reverse or inverse trophic pyramid. You also have most of your primary production being done also have most of your primary production being done by algae, not plants. And last but not least, even though on land you only have photosynthesis, in marine ecosystems you have both photosynthesis at the top and chemosynthesis at the bottom. So that's it. That's really what I wanted to talk about today with how energy flows through marine ecosystems. And tomorrow what I want to get into is actually specifics about chemosynthesis and really what that is, because a lot of people don't talk a lot about that. So that's the next lesson, but thanks for listening.